Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Dr. Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. His latest book, Feeling Great, contains powerful new techniques that make rapid recovery possible for many people struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Burns is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Hi, David, and welcome listeners to episode 228. A few episodes ago, we asked people if they had ideas for podcast episodes to email us, and Tommy emailed you with a really interesting idea for a podcast episode, so we're going to dedicate this entire podcast to Tommy's idea, and it's on the evolution of team. And I'm not going to read a separate endorsement, because there's one embedded in his letter. So I want to just start by reading his letter. Hi, Dr. Burns. I hope you're doing well. I just recently completed your book, Feeling Great, and found it incredibly helpful. I found the technique chart that offered specific techniques for each distortion to be incredibly valuable, and I've incorporated it into all my daily mood logs. I've also listened to every podcast and have been already exposed to nearly all of the content within the book. But the book did such an elegant job of simplifying everything and putting it into context. I've already gifted it to several family members, and I am eagerly awaiting the audio version so I can gift it to my grandfather, a psychodynamic therapist of 30-some-odd years who's vision impaired. I think he'll get a lot out of it. Beyond the well-deserved praise, I'm emailing because I just listened to your recently posted podcast episode 222 with Dr. Borowski, and you asked for any suggestions the audience might have concerning future episodes. There were two things that you mentioned that made me think an episode on the evolution of team might be really cool and insightful. You mentioned that team was specifically developed to deal with borderline personality patients that you saw at Penn, and you also described an interaction with a stranger in California who approached you that inspired the concept of fractal therapy. I think it would be incredibly interesting if you gave a sort of chronology of team and what problems some of the core components were intended to solve. For example, some insight into how you came up with positive reframing, the magic dial, perhaps even uncovering techniques, and whatever else you'd be willing to share. Besides being interesting, I think it would be valuable because it would provide greater insight into the team processes through demonstrating how team has overcome some of the obstacles that traditional cognitive behavioral therapy was unable to overcome. Dr. Mark Noble's chapter in your book, Feeling Great, led me to think quite a bit about this, particularly where Dr. Noble described how team is really the ideal therapeutic structure from a neurological standpoint. Certainly, you didn't just stumble into team, and I, for one, would find anything you'd be willing to discuss on the topic really interesting. Thank you again for everything you do. Best, Tommy.
Well, thank you, Tommy. That's a really neat idea. And I just jotted down 10 miscellaneous things that came to mind, and they're in no particular order. They're not in chronologic order. But when I think back on what might have been little turning points in my mind that led to the evolution of team, and I'm just delighted to share them with you. And let me just say at the top that team doesn't replace cognitive therapy. You could think of team as cognitive therapy on steroids, and the cognitive therapy techniques that I and others developed are still pure gold, and I use them every day, but we now have a much more powerful structure for doing therapy, including, cognitive techniques and behavioral techniques and paradoxical techniques and interpersonal techniques. It's like how we deliver things to the patient that has made such a tremendous difference. Now, I'll just start from the bottom of my list up from number 10. And this is probably a story I've told in the past, but something that really sold me on the idea that you have to have specific techniques focusing on specific negative thoughts or specific problems to cure people, that non-specific techniques like meditation or aerobic exercise or deep breathing exercises or taking vitamins or food supplements, these things will not have specific helpful effects for people for the most part. And I'm thinking of the elderly man who had escaped from Nazi Germany, and he came to New York as a teenager and began shining shoes on the streets of New York City to survive, but eventually became incredibly wealthy. And when he came to me, he was an old man, much probably the way I am now, or even older, and he'd been just severely depressed in spite of incredible wealth and success that he'd had. He owned several blocks of Manhattan. He had a manufacturing plant, but he just felt like a worthless human being, an inadequate man, and those were the days when endorphins were being promoted. It's a fraudulent theory, by the way, that exercise causes an increase in brain endorphins and therefore makes people happy, because we can't even measure brain endorphins. That theory can't even be tested. It's just something that someone made up. But I was kind of believing it, and it was the vogue at the time. And I told him that the reason that his therapy had failed and, that he had been depressed, that he needed to get his brain endorphins up. And so I got him running up to 12 miles a day. And wow. Then I asked him, Ezekiel, how did you feel at the start of that 10-mile run? He said, I felt like a worthless human being. And then I said, and how did you feel at the end of that 10-mile run? And he said, I felt like a exhausted, worthless human being. It just did him not one iota of good. My own experience with running was the same. I've never once had any kind of runner's high. I hate it, and I have to force myself to do it every day. Now, that showed me that non-specific techniques, for the most part, aren't going to help people. And then I finally found out why he felt worthless. He finally confessed after hiding it from all of his psychiatrists. He must have had 50 years almost of failed therapy for feeling worthless. And he finally confessed to me that the reason he felt worthless was because he had two fears, the fear of the dark and claustrophobia. And he was ashamed because he thought that made him less manly. Well, once I found that out, I was able to create some techniques for him using exposure to help him confront these fears and overcome them. And he was able to cure himself by going down into the basement of his house in the middle of the night, rolling himself up in a blanket. So he'd be trapped and in total darkness. I told him just to stay there until he was cured. And he was terrified for about 20 minutes. He had a tape recorder next to his head, and I said, every minute, record what you're thinking. And he had the thought that a fat ghost would come out of the dark and sit on his chest and suffocate him. And wow. He really thought this was going to happen. This was the source of his fear. And after 20 minutes, he finally shouted out, he says, I'm tired of waiting. If you're going to come and sit on me, just do it now. And then no ghost appeared, and you could hear him on the tape. He just burst into laughter, and he was cured at that instant. And so ever since then, I've kind of been focusing. I've developed more than 100 techniques, or learned or developed. Most of them I've developed. A lot of them I've learned. But our current list is a good 125 techniques for crushing the thoughts that cause depression and anxiety, and they're all specific techniques focusing on a specific thought. And then the fractal thing that you mentioned, that I kind of came into full blossom when I interacted with Dr. Mark Noble. I was saying that you can only help someone at one moment of time, but at that one moment of time, all your problems will be encapsulated. And that also became a part of a key part of treatment. And most therapists don't do this or think about this. They try to treat people on a general basis, but what we do in team is to focus on one specific moment when a patient is upset. And the first technique that I developed makes this possible. That's called externalization of voices. And I was going to Beck's seminars. I was it was about 1974, 75, or 76, somewhere in through there, and I was trying to learn a new technique every week, and I noticed that Beck's techniques were good but boring and kind of dry, like examine the evidence. Where is the evidence for this thought or for that thought, or, just stuff like that, but kind of
lacking emotion.
Yeah, lacking emotion, lacking in dynamism. And that's when I thought up the technique externalization of voices. And that was because in medical school, I used to go to these psychodrama marathons. I cut most of my medical school classes, but there were all these wild things going on in the streets of Palo Alto. It was the late 60s, and people were dropping LSD and all this. There was the Human BN up in Golden Gate Park, which I attended personally, and I heard that guy say, tune in, drop in, and drop out. There were all these hippies. It was like pure magic. But in these psychodrama marathons, you'd go into a rented house. You had to stay there for 48 hours with 35 people. And one by one, they would take you into the middle of the circle, and you'd get confronted. And people would rip you to shreds. It was kind of in vogue at the time. The idea was to rip away people's defenses, because people are really pretty phony in a way. And so they would just challenge people and confront people and just keep, it was very powerful. There would be someone behind you kind of speaking for you, and your defenses and vulnerabilities would come out until finally you broke down and sobbed. And then everything would become kind of euphoric. And I saw the power of that technique. And again, some of this might be review, but I never forgot it. Like at the beginning of a marathon, there might be 35 people in a circle, and they'd introduce themselves, and everyone was trying to posture and, impress people. And I remember at one of them, the Stanford psychology professor came, and he was kind of talking about how impressive he was, and he was just there to kind of observe and learn and maybe contribute, to this process. I thought, oh, this guy's going to get killed. He is such a phoney. What a horrible...
Oh, he was actually doing the psychodrama himself?
Yeah, he came as a participant. Because they had their leaders and the assistants. I think most of the people who ran them were like ex-cons or thugs off the street. They were really violent individuals, but they could see through people. They really had this remarkable ability to see how phony everyone was just instantly and start confronting the person.
Wow.
And it was pretty wild. But this professor was saying that, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, this guy, I can't stand him. He's such an ass. And then they finally confronted him, and he had defenses after defenses. And then he finally broke down sobbing and said, my only son committed suicide last week. And he just started sobbing uncontrollably. And he said, I'm so grieved and so ashamed. And suddenly, he became so compelling, and you saw the person for who he is, and that's what I try to do with externalization of voices, just to create that same sudden being catapulted into enlightenment, and to share who you really are, and we see that all the time in our training.
Where you're kind of attacking the
thoughts,
patient,
but in a gentle way. It's not some other person attacking you. It's
right. It's your own thoughts attacking you.
Your own thoughts with frequent role reversals.
Right.
But there's a lot of tears are shed in externalization of voices, and it's very,
Right.
very powerful. And to this day, and I don't know why it is, I remember the day I created that, they had a secretary in Beck's group, and she made a memo and gave it to me and said that this confirms that on this day you invented this technique. So no one
that's
will
nice.
ever be able to pretend it's theirs, because there was a lot of that taking other people's work, sadly, and calling it your own. And that bothered me in the early days of cognitive therapy, to be honest with you, because I in my college education, integrity was always emphasized, and I never had to steal from anybody because I always had too many of my own ideas. But at any rate,
So you made a more gentle psychodynamic what did you call it? Psychodrama?
Yeah, it's kind of a psychodrama type of thing, and it's to this day it's the most mind blowing of all the cognitive therapy techniques, and that's and in team. We use a lot of role play techniques, and most cognitive therapists don't do that at all. They're stuck with this kind of dry stuff, which has value, but not huge value, I would say. Another thing that he said, where did this resistance idea come from? And I can give you a couple of ideas about that. But I treated this businessman who for free, just because I wanted to, because he'd been struggling for 10 years with depression and taken Prozac and all these medications. And his problem was that he thought he had killed his son, his stepson.
Oh.
And do you know this story? Or
did he think he killed his son, or was he worried he was going to kill his son?
No, he thought he had killed his son.
No, I don't know the story.
What happened, he was a single guy, and he fell in love with this woman who had a teenage son who was becoming a problem with the police and hanging out with the wrong gang, and so he took it on himself to save this boy, and he, just to disguise things a little bit, this fellow who I was treating for free, he was a business person, a local business person, but he was also an accomplished skier, and he was like in Sports Illustrated magazine. Those people who ski these impossible wild things.
Right. Yes.
And so he wanted to teach his stepson that, and sure enough, the boy took to it, and they became totally close. And then he married this woman, and he and his stepson were written up as a father-son thing in Sports Illustrated magazine, as very prominent, tremendous athletes. And then on his new wife's birthday, he took his son skiing, and then he said, we have to get home now to celebrate your mom's birthday. And the son said, well, just Dad, one more slow, please. There's this big one that I've never done it, and I want to do it. And the boy was pleading with him, so I'll say, we'll give it a try. And then the boy skied, made a mistake, went off this cliff and crashed on the rocks below.
Oh, no.
And then he called immediately for the helicopters to come, and he was able to ski to where his son was, his stepson. And he took him in his arms, and he was still alive. And he said he was looking up at me through his goggles, and he'd bought these real expensive goggles because he wanted to have the kind that I had. And he died in my arms.
Oh, no.
And he said, I just feel like I killed my stepson. I killed my wife's only child. And he says, I've just been in tremendous pain for the past 10 years. And people try to cheer me up or take this pill or take that pill, and nothing has worked. I said, well, tell me what you've been doing during those 10 years. And he said, well, I'll tell you, I kind of am in a very lucrative area of business, and I could be making, many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year if I wanted to, but to tell you the truth, I'm barely making enough to survive. And I said, well, why is that? Is that due to your depression? He said, well, it might be, but what I do is I help raise money to buy wheelchairs, and then we bring them to Vietnam and places like that, and we give them to people who have been lost limbs in American landmines that were left over.
Oh.
And he said, when I see the faces of those people, it's just the greatest thing in the world. It just, even a cheap wheelchair, it just like transforms their lives. And he says, that's really what I've been spending my time on. And, I don't spend enough time on my business. And he said, do you think there's any hope for me? And then tears were going down my cheeks. And I said, listen, if this is what depression does to people, maybe the problem isn't that you're depressed, but maybe the problem is why are the rest of us not depressed? And it just seems to me that, what you're doing is just incredibly beautiful.
So in working with him, you saw the beautiful side of his depression.
Yeah.
You saw what the depression showed about him.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
And then I cried,
and it spoke
and
to
he
his
was
core
crying,
values.
and it just brought us so close together. And then after that, that was kind of like the empathy and the assessment of resistance part. And then we did a daily mood log, and he just knocked it out of the park. In fact, when he saw how distorted his negative thoughts were, the theme was he always felt like he was failing and not doing enough for other people, or even for a commercial bank that he had his money in, and he was guilty that if he had to withdraw money, it would hurt the bank. And when he saw how distorted that was, he actually started laughing so hard he fell out of his chair and fell on the floor. Yeah. And it was just the most fantastic therapy session ever. It was like...
So then did a light bulb go off in your head and you think, well, if this is true for him, it must be true for everyone. And if it's true for depression, it must be true also for anxiety and he has other challenging feelings.
Yeah, that type of thing began to occur to me. One thing led to the next. I can give you another story about resistance. I was at a meeting of the Stanford voluntary faculty. And it was a small meeting. I don't even remember what it was, but they were just talking about how to teach the residents. And the word resistance came up. And I said, I've heard that word resistance ever since I was a psychiatric resident. And no one ever explained it to me. What's resistance, or what causes resistance? And no one seemed to have anything to say. And so I said, well, all of you must have some theories about it. And if we could maybe make a list of 4 or 5 kinds of resistance, we could give that to the residents. And then they'd see, here are the different kinds of resistance. And then maybe we could have a technique or two to deal with each one. So they wouldn't have to wait till they've been in practice for years and years in order to, figure this thing out. And so I said, I'll circulate an email and you can all add your idea about resistance. And we'll email each other and then I'll compile a list. And then I waited for 6 months. And I didn't get one email from anybody. And I didn't know why, because I thought it was a perfectly interesting and worthwhile question. And then I got real frustrated one night, and I went to sleep, and I woke up in the middle of the night with a dream that I'd had. And in the dream, I saw the 8 most common causes of resistance in a diagram.
Nice.
And that's what led to...
I want to have one of those dreams.
That's what led to, and I got up and wrote it down real fast so I wouldn't forget it, outcome and process resistance for depression, anxiety, relationship problems and habits and addictions. And that original list that came to me in a dream hasn't changed at all. It really kind of put everything together in the way it...
Where did you get the concept of the magic button? Like if you push this button, all of your negative thoughts and feelings will go away.
I can't remember. I'll probably remember after the podcast, and I can tell you the next podcast. But can I say something slightly off color?
Yes, only slightly.
We're going to have a magic button in the app we're developing, but in the script, I describe it as the magic buttocks. But I don't know, but we'll get back to that. Another thing that might be interesting to people is I was trained to help people, and half the time it worked and half the time it didn't, because it seemed like some people were fighting me rather than accepting my help. And it took me quite a few years to figure that out. Maybe I'll just give this one example because it's probably taking too long or something.
No, it's been 25 minutes.
Okay, so we're doing okay. But I had this patient who was one of the most severe cases of borderline personality disorder I'd ever treated. And he was very demanding and constantly threatening suicide. And I kept trying to help him. And he kept telling me, as patients with borderline personality disorder, that kind of I was to blame for his problems, and I didn't care about him enough. I wasn't, loving enough, and that type of thing. And so one weekend, I decided to paradox him, because he'd always be calling, threatening suicide if I didn't talk to him right now. And I was secretly pretty annoyed with him, but I kept trying to help him. And so I said, every time he calls me this weekend, I'll call him back twice afterwards. Did you know this story? to prove to him, that I care about him.
Yeah.
And so I thought, this will really...
I'm just smiling because I think that must have been so time consuming.
Oh, yeah. I ended up with something like more than 50 phone calls with him on the weekend, because my calling him back just reinforced him. So then he'd call back again, and I'd handle it, and then I'd call him back twice more to make sure he's okay. And then by Sunday night, he finally hung up on me and said that I didn't care enough about him. And it just really pissed me off. Excuse the language, I shouldn't say that, but shrinks are human too. And then I had a visit from Wendy Dryden. Have you heard of him?
No.
He was one.
Wendy, isn't that a woman?
No, it's a guy. Wendy. I think it's Windy or Wendy. He's written over 50 books. He's on cognitive therapy. He's from England, and he's really a nice guy. And he used to come and visit me and Albert Ellis once a year from England. And so he'd come, and first he'd go to New York and meet with Albert Ellis, who I thought was really awesome. And then he'd come to Philadelphia and stay at my house. And we had a pool with a little spa, where a hot tub type of deal. And so we'd get in the hot tub, make it real hot, and drink pina coladas. And it was really fun. And then, but he was a shrewd guy. And I told him about this case and how stuck I was with this guy. And he said to me, well, why are you trying to help him so much? And I said, well, what do you mean, Wendy? And he said, well, in London, we have a clinic for people with borderline personality disorder. And we tell them that all they're allowed is 1 3-minute phone emergency call per week. And I said, well, then what if they say that's not enough? And he said, well, then we tell them, I guess we're not offering enough. Go away. Go wherever you want. Get whatever you want. This is what we're offering. And he said, we make people accountable. And I thought, wow, no one ever told me I could make patients accountable. And I said, isn't that dangerous, Wendy? And he says, I think we're getting way better results than in the old days when we tried to help people, and then we got taken advantage of right and left, and people would commit suicide, and horrible things would happen. And now we tell people we won't put up with it. We care about them, but here's what you're going to have to do if you want to work with us. And I said, my gosh, that makes sense. And so the next time I saw this patient, I said, we're not getting anywhere. And I'm trying awful hard to please you, and you're not trying hard to please me. And this isn't going to cut it. You're not doing your psychotherapy homework. You constantly make emergency phone calls. And I'll give you 1 3-minute phone call per week. And you're going to have to do your psychotherapy homework. And if you don't feel like doing it on a particular day, then you're going to have to do twice as much, or I'll stop working with you. And I'm not trying to get rid of you because I really like you, but I want to see you change your life. And so we're going to have to work together in a way that's going to make that happen. And by gosh, he fell right into line. He became really very pleasant and hardworking, but it was like the death of my old self. It was very hard. And to this day, I see a lot of therapists who are indignant about their codependency and their narcissism, that they take pride, as I used to take pride, in not making patients accountable, thinking I was going to save everyone and be a hero for everyone. And once I let that go and made patients accountable in a loving way, the way Jill Levitt models it, the way David can model it, that like, I really care about you, but if you want to work with me, you're going to have to do psychotherapy homework. If you have anxiety.
Well, where did you even get the idea for psychotherapy homework in the first place? Even before that?
Let me see. Psychotherapy homework was kind of a part of cognitive therapy in the early behavior therapy. I used to have the historical references to it. Like I think in the 1930s, a psychoanalyst published the first paper on the use of psychotherapy homework. But by the time the cognitive and behavioral therapists came in, that's when it really became popular in the 1950s and 1960s. But no one, so it was just, when I learned cognitive therapy, I learned, you give out these homework assignments and then the patients do them. But then I began to notice that half the patients did their psychotherapy and half did not. And I did research and published it in top psychology journals, rigorous research journals, like Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. And I demonstrated with data from hundreds of my patients in Philadelphia that practically every patient who did psychotherapy homework improved dramatically or recovered within the first 12 weeks of therapy. And virtually every patient who refused not only didn't recover, most of them deteriorated or just dropped out of therapy. And that was the first proof that there was a powerful causal effect of psychotherapy homework on recovery. And so then once I got that data and I published, I did the research on that in the 1980s, and it was the early 1990s that I published that finding in a series of articles in that journal. And that's when I decided to say, at the beginning of therapy, you have to decide if you're willing to do psychotherapy homework. And I wrote that concept of self-help memo, and just decided to tell patients at the initial evaluation that if you want to work with me, this is not optional. This is mandatory. And if you do it, we can't fail. And if you don't do it, we can't succeed. And so if you don't want to do homework, then I'm not the guy that you want to work with. And that was hard. And to this day, a lot of cognitive therapists and psychodynamic therapists, they refuse to do that because they think somehow these people need long-term insight-oriented therapy, and somehow eventually they're going to correct the patient's depression or whatever it is without making the patient accountable. But personally, I don't think it's possible. But there's powerful emotional barriers that therapists have, and I had those barriers myself, and I fought against letting go of them. And when I finally was able to do that, the heavens have opened up. Those are just a few of the highlights. I can mention one or two other real quick things.
Well, what about the time that Jill said, she didn't get to do positive reframing in one of her classes with you.
That was what I just was going to say.
Oh, that's
yeah. And we're going to see her again tonight, and maybe we'll be able to record what we do with Jill tonight. But yeah, she was asked me to work with her one Tuesday night in our group when we were doing personal work, and she, like all or most young mothers, she had some concerns about her sons, and she was afraid one of them would grow up without being loving or caring, and she saw him growing up as a serial killer or something like this, and completely blew it out of the water in the session. It was a wonderful session, and all of her negative feelings disappeared. I just attended the bar mitzvah of her youngest son, and they both just turned out, they're fantastic kids. But at the end, she said, "David, I'm a little disappointed that we didn't do the positive reframing. And the reason I didn't do it was because I used to think it was just for resistant patients. And Jill is not resistant. She's incredibly motivated." And then I said, "You're right. We should have done that. And from now on, let's do it with every single patient." And that was a landmark thing, because I originally just thought of it as an anti-resistance device for patients with borderline personality disorder or people who were fighting against recovery. And then...
Okay,
Yep.
Can I have one more question?
Okay, and I have one more tiny, mini, quick breakthrough.
Okay, lots of traditional cognitive behavioral therapists don't go very deeply into the emotion with their patient. It's just here's a target behavior, here's a behavior we want to target to eliminate, and here are the steps to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, and then
it's all methods.
Yeah, it's all methods, and it's a lot of intellectualizing.
Yeah.
And in team, TE, the empathy, you have brought in the feeling aspect you've brought in feeling aspect and, closeness and connection to the cognitive behavioral therapy world. Yeah. And how did that get, how did you bring that into it?
Was that I sucked at empathy. I was the prototypic cognitive therapist. I was Mr. Clever Techniques. And when I was stuck with patients, I'd make up more techniques. That's why I have, easily more than 125 techniques today. I used to create as many as 7 or 8 new techniques in a single therapy session with difficult clients. And then, as I talked about in Feeling Good, I happened to have this medical student from England, Sterling Morey, sit in with me for a month on my sessions. And I noticed that he was very genteel, he was very delicate, he wasn't aggressive, but he had this way of empathizing with anybody, even patients who were in a rage. And he'd have them in sobbing in tears like little angels in 30 seconds. And I said, my gosh, this guy is a genius of some kind. And I was teaching him cognitive therapy, but I said, he's got something I don't have. And if I could develop even half of what he's got, I'd be so much more effective as a therapist. So I gave names to what he was doing, as you know. And I said, well, let's call that thought empathy, and let's call that feeling empathy. And now he's agreeing with the patient. We could call that the disarming technique. And then he shares his feelings. We'll call that I feel statements. And he does a lot of stroking. He expresses a lot of admiration for anybody, and it's genuine. And he asks questions and opens people up. And so I wrote down those as the names of things and defined them. You've seen the list with the 5 secrets. And then once I had that list to teach myself, I did a lot of practice drills on paper and role play. And then I started training my students with these role play techniques. So you'd have an attack from a patient, you'd have to respond using the 5 secrets, as you know so well, and then get an immediate grade on it. Because I've been into measurement and accountability, not the vague mumbo jumbo that I had as a resident, where everything was just BS. There was no measurement of anything, and it was just nonsensical. Really, the training, it really was bizarre, but it was the way things had been for decades, and so that's what I brought in, that that empathy piece and the value of compassion. And over time, I got really good at it. Now I still screw up from time to time. I think most of us do, but I've gotten like 50 times better at it than where I started out. And I'm a strong believer that you can learn tremendous empathy skills, but it has to be measured. And you've got to measure it at the end of the session with a scale. That's why I developed my empathy scale. And therapists have to be willing to be rated by your patients, because even when the therapist thinks they're doing a good job, generally the patient will give them a failing grade on my empathy scale.
So did you bring in the testing because of your own background as a researcher?
Yeah, because I was doing 3 years of research after my residency, toward the end of my residency and after. So we were measuring depression all the time. And then when I went into private practice, I said, I'll use the Beck test because patients can take it on their own. So I won't have to waste therapy time. And at first I didn't think it would be any good because I thought, I'm a researcher. I know how patients feel. Patients don't know how they feel. See, I was taught to believe that junk too. And most psychodynamic therapists and psychoanalytic therapists to this day believe that junk, that they somehow know how patients feel, and they don't. And then I said, wow, this Beck test isn't half bad. But then historically, I got a letter one day saying, if you keep using the Beck test, Beck's going to fine you $10,000. For copyright violation. And I got pissed off because he'd been letting us use it for free. And it seemed cold. And I said, this test isn't very good anyway. It only has a reliability of about 0.75 to 0.8. That means that a third, at least, of the score you get is error variance. It's only like 65% accurate at best. And I said, I'll bet I could develop really short scales with reliabilities in the 90s, and that'll be way more useful. And that brought in the whole testing thing. But it was really a moment of anger. A lot of the developments have come out of anger at the way the field was organized, the way the therapy was working. And one thing I have to thank my Amherst College education for, I was a philosophy major, but what we really learned was critical thinking. And a lot of team came about because, it's been a team thing. You've contributed, Jill has contributed, Matt May has contributed. We've had a lot of really giants, kindly people who have contributed, but a lot of it was just critical thinking about how screwed up the whole field of psychotherapy is, and attempting to move it from competing cults. See, to me, Beck is a cult leader. Albert Ellis was a cult leader. I loved Ellis. He was a kook, but he at least had integrity. But, Fritz Perls was a cult leader, and Carl Rogers was, and certainly Freud was. And it just reminded me of religions, fighting religions.
But gosh, wouldn't some people say that could be true for you too?
I have been taking cult leader lessons. Thank you. I've been aspiring to that, because if I can become a cult leader, I'll just become rich and famous. People will adore me. But I'm all.
We've talked about that before.
Yeah, I'm all for measurement and for testing at every single therapy session. And now that we're developing the app, we're going to be able to do research on how psychotherapy works. That's going to be mind-blowing, and the research often will show that our theories are not correct, and that will lead to new and improved ways of thinking. And that's the way I think therapy should be, a data-based, science-based thing, and not following the teachings of some cult leader. I always tell people, when I give workshops, I usually say, now, I'm going to give you some radical stuff, and a lot of it will seem totally inconsistent with the way you've been trained, radical new ideas. And everything I say, I'm going to say with enormous enthusiasm and enormous conviction. But keep in mind that half of what I say is pure gold and half is pure bullshit. and I can't tell which half is half. It all sounds good to me. So use your good judgment and take it with a grain of salt and question anything. And even during the workshop, if you want to bust me and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about in this regard or that regard, I'll be the first to agree with you and make you glad that you brought up that point.
Cool.
So that's some of it.
I think that's good. When you remember how you came up with the magic button, we'll include that in another podcast.
Okay. There were a couple other things, but that's enough. And so thank you, Tommy, for that cool question. I really enjoyed answering it, and it was kind of an honor for you to ask that question.
Yeah, it was fun. Okay, thank you, listeners. Till next time.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, the director of the Feeling Great Therapy Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.